The pharmaceutical industry is a complex and fascinating field. It takes countless of people to bring a high-quality product to the market. In the Qualitalks podcast, I bring to you leaders, experts, and innovators who will share their experiences and explain to us how they do it. Welcome to the Qualitalks podcast. I'm Jan Kugler, host, and my guest today is Borislav Milev. Borislav is an expert in computer system validation. And today we have a really fascinating topic, cloud services. And we're going to talk about what are cloud services, why are they needed now in the pharmaceutical arena, what are the advantages and the challenges in using such services, and we're going to touch the areas of validation and vendor qualification. So let's get to it. Borislav, welcome to the Qualitalks podcast. Really excited to have you on the show. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure for me.
Amazing.
To talk about such a topic that is becoming like very favorite of me and very important in the field of validation.
Yeah, so it's really a cool topic, and I find it really interesting. So again, our topic today would be cloud services, validation, qualification of such services. And it is a really cool service because I think it is the future, let's say, because in the private sector, like almost everything is already cloud services. But pharma is sometimes lagging a bit behind. And it takes time to change the services and adjust yourself. So it's a really cool topic, but I think that in the future, much more will be cloud-based because it's so convenient and so on. So Borislav, tell us a bit what is a cloud and what are cloud services? What maybe categories is there of such services?
Well, yeah, I mean, cloud and basically remote computing is nothing new. Also in the pharma field, virtualization through Citrix and so on. It's been there forever. However, the cloud has some different models. Basically, you can rent services, and this is where this term as a service comes from. You can rent infrastructure as a service, where only the infrastructure, basically the backbone, the servers, the storage space, most importantly, comes from. You can also rent a whole platform as a service, and there you also have your own operation system. You don't have your own, you have the one provided. And basically, it's a whole environment, a runtime where you can run your own software, your own scripts, in pretty much configured by the provider. And of course, the model that most of the people imagine when they talk about cloud is the software as a service. That's a software sitting on some remote server that you access from anywhere. And this gives you the most flexibility. This gives you the opportunity to basically completely outsource your software to a company that is doing this as their main service. The software as a service gives you basically the advantage that you can focus on your own core business. You can produce your medicines and technically outsource all your software problems on a service provider. It could be Amazon, it could be Microsoft, it could be any large one or a smaller one, and let them take care of that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in pharma, when I think about it, so what can basically you outsource? So usually, basically, it would be probably your QMS system.
Mm-hmm.
That's very common. So that would be the most common thing to outsource and use a cloud service for it. What else can you outsource, for example? So probably not local quality control operational systems. It wouldn't work. But what else can you outsource?
If you have certain specific software that is requiring a lot of computing power, you can use a platform as a system where you install it and it could be your own, it could be third-party software that you buy from another provider, but you install it, for example, on the Amazon cloud. I hope it's fine with name dropping of,
Yeah,
but
it's okay.
Amazon is like a household
Yeah,
name.
of course,
We
everybody.
cannot just skip it.
Yeah, sure. So everybody knows all those systems. So of course, it's there is no suggestions.
Exactly.
Everybody should, do the analysis for himself whether he should use this
Exactly.
or that. But of course, Amazon has a really powerful servers, and they are state of the art. And I think many big companies use the service from Amazon.
Yeah, if you want a lot of computing power, that could be, I don't know, genomic sequencing, that could be processing of large data sets, that could be also like simulations of molecules if you do some drug discovery. And there you can use the platform as a service where you say, okay, I want your powerful backbone, I want your platforms that are running smooth, and then I'll just install my software.
Exactly. So we are not talking about a blog website here.
No.
Right. So then comes the thought about the validation, the qualification, right? So usually when you have the software sitting on your computer, everything is easy. When you outsource and when you use a third-party tool, then comes the question of how do you validate it? Can you trust the supplier with your data, the data privacy, and so on? So what are the considerations here?
When you're choosing a cloud provider, just make sure you choose one that has already done some pharmaceutical projects. Then you can rest assured that you're not the first one using it, that other clients before that used it in a compliant manner. And for example, when I say Amazon and Microsoft, they will provide you certain information in the form of white papers, in the form of video, or even sales pitches, sales presentations that they'll give you, where they'll explain you how they're managing with conformity, how their cloud can store in a conform manner electronic records, how they're GMP or GXP compliant, and so on. And this is a very, very valuable information from the supplier that you should leverage on, because you have to describe in your own validation plans and validation reports. You have to have your operations manual, how to manage the life cycle of the whole system. And this is where this information comes.
And how much can you really trust the paper and the documentation that you get from the suppliers without having your local experts? So I had a great talk with Daniel Milev. He's also a CSV expert, and we talked a lot about the validation and what companies usually fall short. And many companies, they put a lot of trust on suppliers, and they just take their documentation, run with it as is, without testing the software a bit more, without really having a good URS in place. What should the software do? What should it do? So and then you have the danger of having a system that is not compliant enough to your purpose. So how do you go about it with such services? Can you get a demo? What should you ask?
This is a common phenomenon. Yeah, most of the time the sales agent tells you, yeah, the system is validated, it is working, but yeah, I want my own system, my own instance of this system to be validated, which is a completely different thing.
Exactly.
And basically, yeah, you have to have your own validation specialists. Validation of cloud services is not a problem. It has been done before. It works. So you just need to have a good validation expert on your side. You have to communicate very well with the representatives of the company that is selling you the services. As I said, leverage on the documentation, but not just copy as it is and sign it off as your own. And you have to have very good contracts. You have to have your purchasing department on board and involve them in negotiations. I assume you're working as let's say the general case, if you want to work with Amazon as a solution, then you're probably a large pharma company. And then you have certain leverage, certain bargaining power when you're negotiating with them. Don't just say, oh no, they're a multi-billion company, we cannot do anything, we cannot tell them anything. You have your sales agents there, and this guy he's interested in selling you something, and they will make sure that everything works smooth. But your purchasing department has to be on board. You cannot just say, hey, just purchase me some service and I'll deal with it. You have to work closely. I would advise also to have a project manager that is very involved in the project, not only validation lead, because this project manager has to communicate with a lot of different, not only stakeholders, but also people working on the project. You have your implementation specialist, you have your validation specialist, you have your QA department, and coordinating might be a little bit troublesome sometimes.
Right. And you need, of course, your own IT on board. So many forget
Exactly.
the IT because you usually don't hear of them, but they're a very important part of your validation team because they are the ones that need to make sure that it integrates with all your other systems, that it is the third-party tools are integratable and can really work well together.
Well, in this case, we assume that your IT also wants to leverage on the cloud solution, so probably they don't have maybe that much expertise in the cloud area. Most of the time, the implementation will come from an external provider also.
The supplier cannot do everything alone anyway, so they will need to work on it together. So how do you validate it, the cloud service?
You can use a very classical approach, the GAM5V model, of course, risk-based. What I would recommend is to make it a little bit more agile, in a sense that it's not so trivial to implement such a system, and you might not be able to implement it at once. Write the specifications and then test it at once and then assume that it's gonna work. You might need to introduce it in several phases, where you start with certain core features and then you add on top of that, and then you add another module, and some mixed agile approach, and the V model would be probably the best solution. But technically, you have your specifications, then you build your system, and then you test against these specifications. That would be the classical V model. It's another question how big you make this V model, whether you have the whole specifications at once or you work in small chunks in an agile way. I would also recommend using some software for managing your requirements. Maybe Jira, that's probably the most common and that most people know. Of course, you need to have your QA department on board there, because in Jira it's not so easy always to sign off requirements, to make sure that QA saw them and in a compliant manner. Maybe your electronic signatures maybe you have requires on electronic signatures in your company that are not so
usually a good integration is with your change management system, where you can push work packages or something like that, that you work simultaneously with the project management tool.
Exactly. HPALM is another option that you can use, whereas it's not so good for managing requirements, but that's probably the state of the art for managing tests. Team Foundation Server is also another option. But yeah, you also need a system where you have a way of managing your tests. They don't necessarily need to be automated, but it's very advisable to have the output of the tests printed as a report from the system and not just printed on paper or filled in by hand. So to sum it up, your company has to have a certain level of IT maturity before approaching this cloud topic.
So let's talk a bit maybe about Agile. So in Pharma in general, it's something that is not used much, but you say, okay, you must have QA on board and the production must be on board. So Can you maybe give some overview about the mindset that they should bring with them when they work on Agile, how it's different from the day-to-day work in pharma when you work on Agile projects?
Yeah, most of the time, complete like pure agile in the most modern, let's say, sense of the word, is difficult to implement in pharma. You cannot just have daily Scrum meetings where you decide on new URS, or where you decide on new features that you want in your software. This is not gonna work for obvious reasons. But most large projects start as the classical V model where we have to make all the specifications at once, and then people realize this is not possible. And then they go for some hybrid solution between the two, where they introduce several phases of the project, where they say, okay, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then we have a few changes, and then we have our project ready. So technically, you're gonna use the classical V model in smaller chunks, as I said, and sometimes the pharma companies are a little bit hesitant because they say, we still work on paper. It is difficult to introduce an electronic system for managing requirements just for this project. Because they think this system has to be validated and so on. This is not always the case. We have this new philosophy of doing validation, the CSA, computerized software assurance, that is being right now proposed by FDA. We're still waiting for the draft of the guideline. Basically, one of the postulates of this is that you don't need to validate your supporting systems. So I assume Jira or Team Foundation Server or HP QC or ALM will fall under this assumption, and basically it would be relatively easy to introduce Jira as a requirements management solution in your company in the near future. And once you have this, you can leverage on this flexibility that the tool offers. Of course, you have to change a little bit your philosophy. You have to change this mindset of, I'm writing one document and 5 people have to sign and approve it after very long discussion and consideration. You have to have a little bit more flexible approach than that. But I think it's slowly coming because the validation leads before they expected that the software was always introduced in one chunk, and this is basically not the case anymore.
Yeah. So how do you do it basically? So you divide it into subtasks, sub-chapters, and also the requirements, and you say we need the software to do A, B, C, D, and then you approach A, you test it, you approach B, you test it, then you see, okay, B doesn't work, let's change something only in B. Okay, you change it, you move then to C, it works, you move to D, again, something doesn't really work out, you change only something in the D, and then you sign off only the final parts in the end, probably, because if you need to get 5 signatures for every change, it will take you years to finish the project. So you need to do a good risk assessment beforehand, and then with this you say, okay, here and here we have a room for changes, and then at the end when you finish it, you see it work, then you come and say, okay, now this works, let's sign off.
Something like that, yeah. You need to have your very sound risk analysis, of course. I assume you also have some way of signing electronically your changes. I assume you're not doing this on paper. And I assume that most of the recent software is actually very modularly built. So you can introduce certain modules at different times without, the software being badly affected by lacking modules. And you also have to have some project risk management, where your project manager says, okay, these are the risks and implications. If we don't get module A on time, we might not be able to use this feature, on time, and they need to speak to the steering committee. What are the implications in terms of costs? What are the implications in terms of time? We see right now, especially in the Corona time, there are a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are trying to push very quickly some projects, which is of course very nice. And working on a tight schedule has to be driven by this project risk management also. You have to know when you're lacking a feature, what is the implications for the whole project.
Okay, I get it. So what do you need to prepare beforehand before you get into this stage of the validation? What's special, unique to such systems? What do you need to get ready?
The supplier qualification, whereas not the qualification per se, but software level agreements, service level agreements, where you defined work packages with your cloud provider, and where you defined how they're gonna manage change, how are they gonna introduce changes to the platform or the software, how are they going to notify you, how are they going to notify you in case of bug fixes, because sometimes during the validation you might have to change a bug before releasing, and so fix a bug before releasing, and so on. So yeah, basically you have to have your supplier qualification and manage your suppliers very well. Then you have to have your specialists on board. Finding a CSV expert, finding a project manager, finding an implementation specialist. You have to make sure they're all there. It is probably advisable to have them locally. Maybe remote work for some parts will work very well, but for some parts it might not. And basically that's it.
Okay.
Have everyone on board and make clear what the tasks are.
Okay, I get it. Perfect. So how do you choose the supplier? So you have a lot of options. How do you choose the right one for your company?
Basically, first of all, I assume you have to speak to the software vendor. They might have someone in mind. They might have done projects like this. It's for the pharma area before, and they might know which cloud provider is the best for their software solution. So they might say, hey, our software would really work well with Amazon at this time, or Microsoft, or whatever. Or if you're buying a software as a service, then you don't have that much choice. You have to choose the software with their own cloud solution. There you just choose a software that fits your purpose best. When you're buying a software and then a platform as a service, then of course you have certain flexibility. But in the end, I would suggest you choose one of the bigger names, because they might have the most experience with GMP compliance, and they can deliver you the most information and the most documents about this GMP compliance. The problem there, of course, is with change management. They might do whatever they want without notifying you, and you need to make sure you have certain bargaining power, where you can tell them, hey, don't introduce changes yet. We need a little bit more time. Well, with Amazon, this is close to impossible, but at least you have to make sure that they are notifying you these changes.
So it's especially when we're talking about service as a software, right? So they do occasionally updates, they upgrade the systems, new versions come out. So you need to make sure that you're notified in advance about any update to the system, so you can check if it influences your data, your compliance, and so on. So you probably need it. So probably many such companies already provide it in advance, but you probably should have it in your agreement, in your quality agreement. That they inform you about any change in advance, and what are the implication of such changes, right?
Yeah, well, it's not that different than if you work in a large pharmaceutical company. Sometimes it happens that IT wants to push an upgrade or update of the system without notifying you. This is not very common, but I've been in a situation where in the last moment I realized somebody wants to update something without letting me know.
Right.
And
Right,
yeah,
but it's already internal problems, and I think this is why it's important to involve everybody, every department, to involve them in GMP. So if you think a bit back, so when we got pushed Windows 7 or Windows 10, and there are so many old software that just don't support it. Right, and in Pharma there are software. I know that there are sometimes old computers with Windows 98 that stand in the corner, and you still there is some specific functions with old production systems that still work only on this computer, and I've seen it many times, and I think that's one of the issues that you really. That's why you also need to upgrade, because you need to understand that you are maybe happy with your software working with Windows 98, but Microsoft doesn't care, and they are gonna push their new product really soon, and you will lose the support for this software also every several years. So you need to progress.
Yeah, it's advisable that you as a validation specialist also treat your internal IT department as an external service provider. And in certain cases, you might even need to have some written service level agreements. You might also need to qualify them if you're, in certain cases, if they belong to a different company inside the whole company holding. But at least have them work close with them, have them on board, and talk to them very closely. That applies to pretty much every project. It's not only particular for the cloud. Make sure your IT is on board with GMP, and they have this quality and GMP mindset.
Right. So that's really important. And one thing that comes to my mind actually, so this is a real benefit of software as a service because it doesn't care what operational system you have. So it doesn't care if you have like Windows 7, Windows 8,
Exactly.
and so on. So it sits on the cloud. It will always be compatible because they are mostly work for your browser applications. So it usually works out fine, and it doesn't matter what system you have, right? Depends on maybe on your computing power, but also not that much because all the computing happens on the cloud.
Yeah, exactly. That's the main benefit of the cloud, this flexibility. There are, of course, drawbacks. I wanted to talk about this point also. One of them is where the data is residing. In the European Union, you have to know where your data is, what happens to your data, and how it is stored. And of course, when we introduced the GDPR in Europe, the cloud providers, of course, they knew about it, and they wrote white papers, they gave information, and that's fine. But still, you need to make sure that, for example, your data is stored inside let me think how it was, the European Union, I think, or maybe it's even, maybe it's best to store it locally in Germany if you work in Germany, as in my case. So yeah, you have to know the location of your data, and you have to be in control of your data, which is not that trivial. When the data is stored on your own server that is in your back office or something, it's a completely different story. You know what happens to the data, and whereas in the cloud, you have to make sure that this is written somewhere, documented. Otherwise, you might run into trouble.
I think it's also a consideration, right? So it's also, I think maybe people are more comfortable to having all the data stored in their back office and their own servers. But I think the new clouding solution, they're much more secure because the new service, it's basically distributed in so the idea of the cloud is distributed data, so you don't have your information on one specific box somewhere. You have it distributed in several servers and locations simultaneously, so it basically one place burns, the other ones are still fine, right? So this is the biggest advantage here.
Yeah, that's a very good advantage, a very good point. There is certain storage redundancy, so you know that your storage is always working, it's always there. There's certain uptime that you have to negotiate with your provider. Sometimes that's an important point. Sometimes they say, okay, 99.7, for example, and which basically it's a couple of hours per year. And for certain services, for a lot of services, this is acceptable, of course. But imagine that your emails are not working for 8 hours in a year, and these 8 hours fall on one shift of 8 hours. That's basically 1 day out of 200 working days where your email is not working. And just an example, most of the pharmaceutical systems are probably not that time sensitive, but of course, if your system is dealing with the releasing of charges, of batches, sorry, then it's a different story. If you cannot release a batch for 8 hours, that might not be so pleasant. Yeah, so basically, you also have the security concepts in place, especially the large cloud providers. You can rest assured and sleep well, and you know that there's not going to be a large fire destroying your data, for example. I'm not saying that this is a very typical scenario in the pharma companies, but yeah, you have to make sure that you have your locations normally in the usual case, that you have your location security, that you have your physical security of the server rooms, that you have your smoke detectors and so on. And this is not your core business. You can as well outsource it to a cloud provider.
Right, especially that in comparison, it's so affordable right now.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So I think it costs less to outsource this part of your operation, because think about the security and the upgrades that you need to do and the maintenance and so on and so on and so on. And basically nowadays it's so quick and much more even reliable, because you are so as a farmer, you're not an expert in computing, in cloud computing, so you can give it to the experts to deal with it, right? You just need to choose the right ones to host your data or to host your software. So again, maybe to summarize, if you can give a few tips to consider when you qualify such service providers, for example, in comparison to other vendors that you need to qualify. Do you have something really specific that comes to your mind and you say, okay, if I wouldn't work in this environment, I wouldn't think about it, or I notice that other people whom I work with, they don't think about it because it's not that trivial, but you really must do it in this case?
I think in this case, that would be the contracts. You have to negotiate contractually pretty much everything. Just on the top of my mind, that's the uptime. Of course, if you want more uptime, you have to pay more for something like a premium service. And the service desk, the support levels you have to negotiate, because your IT cannot drive to Amazon and fix their wiring. Okay, that's an extreme scenario again. But make sure you have these things on paper before it's too late. Make sure they know what their work package is, what documents, what deliverables they have to give you, what service they have to do instead of you. Because, for example, let's say I mentioned changes several times. Negotiate contractually how you manage changes. Business continuity, negotiate this contractually. This is not in your power. You cannot decide it after you implement the system. You cannot wait for a few months to see how it's running and then decide how to work on that. No, you have to know this in advance. As I said, bring your purchasing department on board, know how much your budget is, because cloud computing can also be costly, uptime can be costly, and you have to know, don't just run for the highest, premiumest level of the service, but make sure that make some risk analysis and assume and say, okay, maybe 8 hours per year of downtime is not so bad for our batch releasing. Who cares? What else? Make sure you have single point of contact when it comes to the cloud provider. That you have named contacts there that you can reach, that you can lead the negotiations also with during the supplier qualification and the supplier management. Let's not just limit to the qualification part. And yeah, that's the biggest risk basically of a cloud solution is your cloud service provider.
Right.
And it's not anymore the testing of the system. We assume that the system will work. It is you have to focus on the life cycle of the system mostly.
Right. So when I think about the cloud providers, it also depends what they provide, which systems, but I would think consider them as a really critical vendor because they hold all your data. If, as we talked about downtime, if they're not reliable, you can lose your system for a long time. You can lose money. You can lose batches. You lose time. You cannot release the batches and so on and so on. Probably if you use some computing power for production purposes, suddenly you cannot produce because this system doesn't work. So I would think, okay, you really need to qualify them correctly, and also you must have an audit, right?
It depends. No, I would follow your supplier qualification procedure and see what its risk assessment says, because you can have a software on the cloud that is managing your batches, but you can also have a software that is probably managing your, I don't know, schedules for maintenance.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is not so critical, you know.
So let's talk about the criticals, right? So for the critical ones that really can impact the quality and your product life cycle and the production, right? So if you need to do an audit there, what can you check and what can you expect them to provide you?
First, I would do it very extensively if it's a critical system. I would start with the self-assessment or letter audit. Have them send me as much information as possible and see what their weak points are. Let's say maybe their audit trails are not so well defined, maybe their change management is not so well defined, and make sure that in a possible audit you carry these points over in the audit and make sure that you look into them further. Now, I'm not so sure how good you can audit one of the large cloud suppliers, but I assume you can still audit them. I know, for example, you can audit SAP. You don't have to be scared of how large they are. Most of the time, you're also working for a large pharma company. This leverage is on your side. Don't be scared to ask them.
But I think also if you're a small pharma company or medical device, I think you should also insist, because in the end it's your process, it's your product. So if you go to Amazon or some other provider says, no, I'm sorry, we don't have time for you, so you can maybe look for another partner who is much more eager to have you as an account. Because
a refusal to carry out an audit is also a result of the audit. You can say, okay, this is not the right partner for this endeavor.
If they don't take me seriously, I also think about the service. So if they are not serious in getting me on board, so it probably would mirror the same on on the service and the function. Right.
Exactly, and I have no control on these guys, and it would be dangerous and risky to work with them.
Right. So also during the audit and the qualification, so I consider audit for the critical systems as part of the qualification. So what documentation can you require? What can you look at? What would be important?
Written procedures, I would say, for a lot of the topics from the life cycle of the system. That will be like audit trail, data management, data governance, change control. They should have written procedures that are available. If they don't want to send them to you in paper or digital, you might go there to the audit and read them there or whatever. But they should have written procedures for these things, and of course, certificates. I would say ISO 27001 for the IT security, 9001 maybe. I'm not so sure they have this, but 27001
For
should
the
be
data security, right? And
for IT security.
right. Does it also include change management, change control procedures like ISO 9001 or not?
Oh, depends how they manage change. If they are ISO certified, yes. If they have this, otherwise but no matter if they're certified or no, they should have some written procedures.
So I think
for
it
these things.
would. So I think when you are giving away as a pharma, as a GMP, when you give away part of your process to another company, it means that they have to comply with the same regulation as if it was in your site, right? So if this is part of the GMP system, it means that the provider must follow the same procedures, right? So you cannot say, okay, we outsource it. They are not even ISO. We have no idea what they're doing there, right? So you cannot say it because if the regulators come and say, okay, you use this system to release batches, how can you make sure that everything is working well? Show me the changes that they did, and if they don't write it down. So as a software company, of course, the version it is documented, but the question is how well is it documented? And
that also,
right? How well is it documented, and how much access the company's employees have to the system, right? So as a pharma company, you need to make sure that only specific people from your employees have access. But if on the other side, everybody has access to your data, they can manipulate it on their side. Somebody, I don't know, just for the fun of it, can play with the data or just will be curious and by mistake changes something. So you need really to make sure that your GMP requirements extend to the vendor.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. Also, certain cloud providers will have some tools that you can use. For example, I know for Amazon, they have this audit trail of the configuration where you can check at any time what the configuration is and what changes were made. And this is recorded not only of the trail of the data, but also of the configuration of the cloud. Especially if you use some elastic loading and if the processing power, the computing power is changing with time, you can require an audit trail. What was the processing power when you did your calculations? This is a very, very particular case, and it's not, probably you're not going to need this, but there are certain tools. What I want to say is there are certain tools that you can use, and make sure they show you this. Make sure you consider them not only in your validation, but also in your supplier management, and see for yourself, decide for yourself.
So you need to think what you would have needed if the system was on your platform, it was in your site, and it should be the same that way. So you need to take this in consideration and ask for the documentation and ask to see the demos and see if it really works. If you can access it, if you can give admin rights to certain people in your organization to access the data or not, how it works. And I think it's really critical here Right.
See what trainings do they have also. We know that the
Exactly.
large cloud providers have certifications and trainings. You can get an implementation specialist that has been trained before. But with smaller providers, I'm not so sure how willing they would be to teach your implementation specialist how to work with the clouds and so on. And this is also an important point, how transparent they are in terms of training, how willing they are to train.
Right, right. So I think it's really important that they should have at least seminars for key personnel, for key users in your site that use it to train them regularly with updates and maybe videos and webinars and so on and so on. Because if they change something in the system, you need to follow up with it. So this is also really important. If somebody does an update to your system, so this vendor updates something, do you need to test it and revalidate something?
That's a very good point that I also wanted to mention. You have to have a certain risk assessment on each change. Even when they, let's say Amazon says we're going to change this and that functionality or module, you have to have immediately a risk assessment. What are the implications for my functionality and before being introduced? It might be something super critical that basically needs to stop everything and reconsider Amazon as a provider. That's an extreme case, but yeah, you have to at least decide which test cases you want to run again, to have some regression testing to make sure that your system works as it was working yesterday. And that's why I was recommending HP Quality Center or ALM for managing your testing, where at least you can get automated report out of the testing, even if you test manually.
So what is this? Is it a system that is connected, is a software that is connected to systems and runs some test with reports? What is it actually?
I think it has this functionality, but HPLM, most of the time I've seen people are doing manual tests as they would do them, but document them there. And it's very handy for documenting test steps, for managing results of test steps and reporting of these tests.
Okay, so it connects with the system and then it's like does some recording of your steps and so on?
It depends how you automate it. I think it has this functionality. As I said, most of the time I've seen it manual. When you have something like, I don't know, 150 test cases with 20 steps each, it is valuable to be able to search for steps, to tag them, maybe to assign them to different people if you have more than one tester. Of course, you have automated systems. That would be. I'm not a specialist for software quality assurance, but I think that's Jenkins for automated regression testing and so on. If you can find a specialist that can do this for you, this automated testing, yes, sure, why not? Then this reduces your manual testing down to zero. In the long run, it will be economical also, maybe, because I have seen testers, most of a good tester, even when they're doing manual tests, and writing test scripts, they will basically require the same hour rate as a validation lead.
I'm not familiar with this software, so who uses these tools? Usually the IT people or the QA validation experts?
Both. The IT people or the tester will set their test cases, and then QA will approve them. Say, okay, these steps or these test cases, maybe not the steps in particular, but the test cases, elements that you want to test are suitable from my point of view. Then they will release these tests, and then they will also release the results of the tests. Then you can manage your deviations inside this system. Then you can say step this and that was a fail. And then the QA can have a look and then decide whether to release the system for use based on these deviations. Don't underestimate how much time this can save.
Yeah, I'm sure everything that you can automate or test with the software is really a
Yeah,
great solution.
and we also
Right.
come to when you have like 150 test cases with screenshots, that's several folders of paper, and people underestimate how much this costs to storage in a proper archive, how much it costs to move this folder, and how much it costs to print out this folder. Don't underestimate this.
Right.
And yeah, that's I'm a fan of electronic systems for managing requirements, for managing test cases, for validation lifecycle.
If you want to validate such systems, do you need special training, special skills that are a bit different from the regular training that you do for GAM5 or for other system validations? What else do you need to master?
You mean cloud systems, right?
Cloud system, yeah. If you need to validate cloud
Um,
systems.
Try to see to find a validation lead who is if you're a company client looking for a service, look for a validation specialist who has done similar projects in the past. Yeah, check their track record, ask them how do they perform this cloud validation, and look for certain certification. It does not need to be certification as a cloud developer or administrator, but there are certain, let's say, lower level certification. Make sure they know what cloud is. Make sure they know the language and the slang that is involved in this, because they have to communicate with your implementation IT guys. Make sure they're available, that they're reliable people, because these projects might take time. They span over a year, maybe. Um, Contrary to what people think, it's not going to get faster than a normal implementation of a software.
Right.
And if you're a service provider, if you're a validation specialist that want to go into the cloud field, start with some online training. You can use Udemy. They have a lot of trainings that you can buy there for as much as, I don't know, like 20, 30 euro for a full several hours of training course. But of course, I mean, if you want to really develop yourself in the area of Amazon Cloud or Microsoft Azure, then just go for their certifications. You have the online courses provided by them. You have also other online courses, and the online certification doesn't cost that much. The problem is, of course, that it is difficult.
So, Borislav, do you recommend these solutions generally? Should pharma companies who work in or other companies who work in the GXP arena move to cloud solution? What is your
Absolutely,
saying
absolutely. I think that is the future. I think it boosts your performance. And I'm talking on a very, very low level. The IT performance is gonna get a boost if you use cloud solutions. Increases your security, increases your data integrity, increases it decreases the effort for the data governance. It is cost effective. It is much cheaper than running your own servers and securing them, and it reduces the load on your IT department. It makes your company, let's say, prepared for the future, because I think that will be the future also of pharma software. Other areas already switched to cloud solutions mostly, and I think that's where pharma is headed. It will increase your, as I said before, the maturity of your company. You might start with some non-critical cloud solution, and then move also your critical solutions to the cloud. And yeah, basically that is it will also increase the awareness of your own QA. It will make your company future proof in a way. That is that is my message to the pharmaceutical industry.
So Borislav, thank you very much for sharing all this amazing information. It's really cool and it's really interesting. And I hope we get to maybe talk about some other topics there or issues in this arena. And if people want to ask you something about this area, if they have questions, they want to reach out, what is the best way for them to do it?
LinkedIn, I'm very active there. You can connect, reach out to me. I'm basically out of the field. I'm not doing any contracting right now. I have a permanent position, but I still have some network in the area. If you want a recommendation for a consultant, or if you just want to talk about cloud validation or any other topic, anything quality related or digitalization in pharma field, feel free to connect.
Right, Borislav Milev, and I'll leave a link to it, and I'll tag you when I post this podcast, of course, so people can reach out and connect with you. So, Borislav, thank you very much for this amazing talk.
Thank you for having me on the podcast. It was a very nice experience for me. And looking forward to more nice videos from you.
Thank you for watching and listening to this episode of the Qualitalks podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing and sharing it with your colleagues.